came up with some issues that we probably don't want to deal with, but,
All right, are we all ready?
yeah,
Let's get this party started.
I'm happy for you. That's a nice job.
Okay, ready? Ready, I'm ready. What's the first thing I do? I think I'd know by now. I'd like to call this meeting to order. This is the December meeting of the Board of Directors of the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District. Thank you all for coming out tonight. May we have roll call?
Director Hoffman.
Here.
Director Adams.
Here.
Director Edwards.
Here?
Director Evans.
Here.
Director Byrne.
Here.
Director Riley.
Here.
And Director Potter.
Here.
All present.
Thank you. And if you'll stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Are there any additions or corrections to the agenda? No. Okay, very well. Moving on. I will open the floor up for oral communications. Anyone wishing to address the board on any consent calendar, information items, closed session items, or anything not listed on the agenda may do so at this time. If you're in the front room and do intend to speak, please come forward.
Dan Turner, Monterey. I got a question for you. After these meetings, do you guys sit around and say, you know, we've really got to speak about all these things that Dan brought up tonight? No? I didn't think so. And rightfully so, because although I appreciate you guys sitting here and listening to me flap my gums, I don't think that you are under any obligation necessarily to discuss anything that I brought up. Now, it seems to me, from listening to the Caliam employees who speak from this very podium, that they aren't necessarily the sharpest knives in the drawer, but Caliam does have enough money to hire some very smart people to advise them on strategy. And the strategy that they seem to have come up with is to make all sorts of complaints and throw all sorts of accusations at the feasibility report, the step-by-step process the board is taking to work its way along in deciding whether and how to proceed, and now at the general manager himself, whom they seem to have determined as their most dangerous enemy. I can almost hear those Caliam consultants asking, don't you have anyone on the board who can make trouble for this general manager? Because you see, the whole point of this strategy is to waste the board's time and energy, to get you fighting amongst yourselves over all these baseless and unfounded accusations, and to distract you from the task at hand, which is getting rid of Caliam and establishing a public water agency for us. In short, just as you are under no obligation to spend time discussing anything that I say, neither do you have to pay any attention to any of Caliam's bleatings, which are only meant to distract you. That's a good line. It's only a distraction. When you are kayaking down a swiftly flowing stream, it is best to stay in the middle of the flow and not get too far over near the banks, because there are eddies there that you can get caught up in that will swirl you around and around and get you nowhere. Likewise, I hope this board will keep its eyes on the prize and not allow Caliam's natterings, not to mention its bitching and moaning and character assassination, to distract you from paddling like our kayaker, straight on and true to your goal. Not only are the gloves off, but some of the masks are beginning to drop. Also, as Cal-Am and its henchmen and women become ever more desperate to derail our movement toward public water. And in the words of Tiny Tim, God bless us, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Anyone else? Okay, then I will close oral communications and we'll move on to the consent calendar. Any directors wishing to pull any items for further consideration?
I would like to pull item 3.
Item 3. Anyone else? Okay,
Item 3 is on page 21 in the board packet, and it has to do with
before you go down that road,
Sorry.
I would like to entertain a motion to approve the remainder of the consent calendar.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a motion from Director Riley and a second from Director Byrne, I believe. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Now, Director Adams, let's discuss item number 3.
Thank you very much. Exhibit 3A is the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District Annual Disclosure Statement for Employee and Board Reimbursement. And I was troubled, and I'm hoping that it's an error, that one of our board members has an extremely high board reimbursement of more than $1,200. And I'm unclear whether that is for this is for reimbursement for mileage expenses of $1,244.95, which seems a little extreme to me because you have to drive a very far distance in order to be able to accrue that much money in mileage. So I wanted to know whether or not it was incorrect, or if it's not, if it's correct. What I really wanted to pull this to our attention for is that I think, if you'll excuse me, Madam Chair, it may be a good idea for us to have some sort of parameters or some sort of policy around board reimbursement and like prior agreement or something, so that we don't find ourselves going way over budget on board travel expenses. So with that, I wonder if there's a response.
Yes, we looked into it, and it is not excessive mileage. Unfortunately, this report's automated. There were 2 reports. One was a mileage reimbursement, and the other was an expense reimbursement that were linked, and it picked up the title from the one, which is only a portion. The rest was airfare, hotel, and other out-of-pocket expenses for a conference. And as you may recall, every director is entitled to attend conferences. Travel to and from an airport is reimbursable. When you do your trainings, so AB 1234 or the sexual harassment training, mileage is reimbursable for that kind of thing as well. So in this particular case, it was only less than a couple $100 of mileage related to the conference and trainings, but it unfortunately picked up the header from just that one of the 2 electronic documents.
And in response to my question of the chair, is there any kind of policy that we have around expenses for board travel?
Well,
I assume there's a budget item.
we do. I think it's in one of our meeting rules or the attachments to the meeting rules. I can get that for everybody. Generally speaking, so for example, we've talked about Aqua DC, the conference fees, the airfare, anything incidental to the event is reimbursable. We don't have a cap on the number of events. I know that in other venues, there was perception of some excessive travel by a city council member. We have not had that perception. Different members have shown different levels of interest to go to conferences and so forth. You're encouraged to go to conferences, both as new members to try to, get the directorship, the Director 101 classes that CSDA does, and later in your tenure, Aqua and networking and things like that. So, but I can get the policies printed out and distributed to everybody.
Thank you very much.
We have a new policy to make sure the headers get done correctly.
Thank you very much for that.
On that, I would like to add on to what Director Adams said, is that I am concerned about, as she is overspending the budget, and so if there is, it would be good to have that policy if there is, like, a particular cutoff, or if it has to be distributed among directors. I'm not aware of what we have, and I've been on this board a while, so I don't know that we've ever even reached any limit that we have placed. So I just want to ask you to, yes, please bring that to us, and then if we require any discussion to change it, then we can put that on a future agenda item.
And we do budget for you based on past experience, and so some years we've not come close. There's been a couple of years where we probably exceeded it a little bit.
Okay. So is that,
That satisfies me, yep.
Okay,
So I
would you-
can make a motion to approve consent item number 3.
Second.
okay, we have a motion, Director Adams, and a second, Director Byrne. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion carries unanimously. We'll move on to the General Manager's report.
I'll try to be brief because there's some interesting stuff later in the agenda. But looking at compliance, we're 2 months into the water year. And ready? There. So looking at both the cease and desist order and the Seaside Groundwater Adjudication report, the key thing to see here is that we are a little over on production from the Carmel River, and the total lower right-hand negative 117 shows we're also a little bit over on the Seaside Groundwater Basin, but primarily on the river. That's not a big number, and keep in mind that we had no rain in October, so there was some residual irrigation still going on. So we'll see how that balances out over time. We are 110 over last year, which probably goes to the same result, same cause. The next one, what's interesting here is without rain, you're not going to get any table 13. We do have a balance in aquifer storage and recovery, but we've not taken any of that in the current water year. And Sand City desal still struggles to produce, so it was at 0. So the other things that kind of add a little bit of additional water around the edges have not yet in the first 2 months. Production for customer service, what you see here is just 2 months, and we're 67 acre feet over. And again, I can't reinforce enough that it was an odd October for us, and so that additional irrigation load. On rainfall, you can see November came in relatively close to normal at just under 2 inches. I can tell you, and we'll see it on the next chart, we've already exceeded an average year for December, and we're only 2 weeks into it. And if you go look, you can see the red line, which kind of meanders off to the right there. That's the cumulative, and its axis is on the right-hand side. So we're basically at 8 inches. And so if all we had in November was 2, that means we've had 6 already in December, which is a couple inches more than a normal December. So we'll see what happens going forward. And again, these measurements are all at San Clemente, so they're watershed. Oops. Finally, or not finally, but second to last, unimpaired flows. November was below average, but December will be likely above average because of that rainfall at the beginning of the year. And then finally, aquifer storage and recovery. I think the scale is off by a digit, John, on the right. I mean, I don't know where John is. We've done, I believe it's just under 100. Oh, it's on the left, sorry. So daily injections, the right hand, the cumulative injections, the left-hand scale. So we're about 98, I think, acre feet to date. And you can see last week was very good. We're expecting that the conditions on the river will prevent further injection here shortly until we get another set of rains. So expect in the next week or so it may wind down until another set of rains come. But looking good. Chris Cook's promised to get me more water, but they're doing the best they can, and John Lear is available if there's any questions on that. That concludes that report.
Okay, directors, any questions?
Yes. Couple of, about ASR. One
Right on
question
cue.
is how the pipeline doing?
Pipeline's only as good as the water that's in it. And
So John, how we doing on injection?
Good evening. Well, the storms came in on December 1st, of course, and then we moved. It filled and spilled Los Padres Reservoir, and then subsequently, about 9 hours later, it opened the lagoon. So we hit a number of our triggers, with December 1st being the first day that we're allowed to divert water. And so we moved into our pre-injection sampling and then started flushing the system. And if you noticed on the graph, that's the first volumes of those first few days. We have to achieve acceptable water quality. We're reversing some of the flows in the system and higher volumes of flow, so we're picking up some pipe scale, and we want to make sure that the system is clean before we put that down our wells. And so that took about a day and a half of flushing, and then we started injection, and the river came up, and so we exited the low flow season, and then Catalam mobilized and went and turned on the upper valley wells to get more flow. And so you can see then that in response to that, that's where we started to increase the daily volumes.
Okay, GM at water supply meeting, you mentioned something about the MOU for ASR with CalAmp?
yeah, so the dates are coming to a close, so we need to either amend or restate that agreement to continue to go forward.
Okay, are we behind on
No.
doing that?
Well, we need to get moving. It's sometime in 2020. John, you actually just sent an email. Do you remember, what are we, about 7 months away, 8 months away?
The original agreement was signed in March of 2006, and so it's 180 days prior to that eclipse of that.
Okay, let's get a letter prepared for the board so we can look at it and then make it official that we asking for negotiations, whatever we got to do on that. I feel we got to stay on top of it. So as soon as possible, and that should run through water supply and come on out to the full board once they look at it, run it through everybody. Thank you, that's all I got.
So
Thank you.
I have a question. So, per this chart graph, is it implying that through May, we're going to be pumping the maximum?
No, that's the permit window is December 1 through May 31st. So for every year, just for my benefit, for quick comparison, I just have, so I can see when it operated and when it didn't. And so it's just showing you the whole time window that you could divert if you meet your in-stream flow requirements.
Okay.
Any other questions? Thanks, John. Okay. And we'll move on to item 7, report on legislative outreach for calendar year 2019.
Yes, and this is just a written report that begins on page 55. The Legislative Advocacy Committee went through it in length and talked about future directions as well at their meeting last week. What's included here is just a brief summary of bullet points of things that occurred during the year, and then a summary of Sacramento and federal meetings that were had, as well as letters of support or letters of opposition of legislation. And we're happy to take any questions on that written report.
Directors, any questions? Very well. Then we will move on to number 8, the attorney's report on the 5 p.m. closed session of the board.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board, members of the public. The board did meet in special session at 5 p.m. The single topic was the performance evaluation of the general manager. The board did provide specific direction to a subcommittee composed of directors Potter, Riley, and Hoffman to refine and return to the full board deliverables concerning the general manager's performance objectives and goals. As the board also reviewed the evaluation format and criteria to be used, and that will all return to the board in the future closed session. That concludes my report.
Excellent. Thank you. Item number 9, director's reports or reports on any activity, city, county, other agency meetings, anything else. Director Riley.
the Water Master met, and it approved the proposal from the city of Seaside to do an in lieu recharge transition mechanism to save the basin from overdraft in order to substitute another supply, which is at the golf course, which is on Salinas Valley, Salinas side. Anyway, I attended a meeting, and that was the action. The other meeting I attended, which is interesting too, was Carmel River Advisory Committee, and they had a joint meeting with the Watershed Conservancy, and it's very informative. I learned a lot at these meetings, this meeting in particular, and I think they're going to be discussing some more efficient way of doing business and dealing with their issues on the Carmel River. And they were thinking about maybe, thanks for all the help I can get. But between the two of them, it was a joint meeting. They're thinking about sorting out how they can be a little more efficient in people's time and so on. So they're thinking about merging those two groups to hold common meetings in the future. But anyway, that hasn't been recommended yet that I know of, but that was being discussed. And anyway, good to know. Efficiency is interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I attended the PUC meeting, the Public Utility Committee meeting they held in Seaside on the moratorium on Calam and Laguna Seca. I'm going to ask the chair, can the public outreach, can we find different ways to notify the public of that? They had 10 speakers. I think it should have been more people notified since it's in our area of what's going on. So I want to thank the PUC for coming down in the local area. And I attended the Pure Water Monterey public outreach for their SEIR. Now, I heard it could be a delay. It's a meeting December the 19th at 3 o'clock at Pure Water if you want to say something on that delay. I don't know if the board want to say anything on it, but it possibly could be a delay, and just letting the public know that we're aware of it. Thank you.
Thanks.
If I can add, I attended that same meeting.
Okay, great. Anyone else? No? No other reports? Okay. Then we will move on to item 10, public hearings. Consider the adoption of January through March 2020 quarterly water supply strategy and budget. Paging Mr. Lear.
Yes, paging Mr. Lear. He left the room.
Okay, good evening. This is a public hearing for the quarterly water budget, chair and board, for the December 16th, 2019 regular board meeting to cover the months of January through March 2020. So every quarter we meet with the CalAM and the regulators to discuss how the different state board orders that regulate how we use water out of the water resources system are to be applied in order to be consistent with all of them. And through this meeting, we talked about the plan for ASR. We had our meeting on December 6th, so we knew we had already started ASR. So the plan is to keep the system ready to continue injection in response to the December 1 storm, and as long as we meet our in-stream flow requirements, we will be able to divert, and we'll be ready to do that and inject into the Seaside Basin. We're also going to continue to divert Table 13 water rights in response to the December 1 storm as well. And Pure Water Monterey operations, after startup, will begin to build up the operational reserve, and the first water available for recovery and to be figured into the quarterly water budget process will likely be in the third quarter of this water year. The strategy assumes full utilization of all the Seaside Basin coastal subarea native groundwater during the water year 2020. It assumes injection of ASR and diversion of Table 13 water rights that will continue through the winter as long as we maintain our threshold flows. And we developed this on December 5th, I guess, by the Quarterly Water Budget Group, which is, of course, us, CalAm, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, United States Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, and the State Water Resources Control Board. In developing this, we always check in with NOAA and their Climate Prediction Center, and you can see that there's a little brown area in our area which is saying there's a 30% chance that we may be drier than a normal water year. So having that with the storm we've had, we're just going to respond to the conditions that exist right now. So this is the table that's adopted for Rule 130, laying out the monthly demand. And then we move down into the January through March. So we should be hitting these targets and comparing to them, and by the end of March we should be on target to use 4,632 acre feet. So then moving on to the system and how to take it out is kind of the meat of what we talk about at these meetings. And so you can see across the top, we're in the mode of ASR diversions and Table 13 diversions. So we're not pumping as much out of the native seaside water, enough to meet some demand and to keep pressures right in that system, but focusing more on the river and being ready to move the water from the Carmel Valley over into the Seaside Basin for consumer use and injection. I don't know if we want to have any questions about the way this table was prepared while we're on it. Okay. So then moving on to the satellite system. This has, of course, been ramped down through the triennial ramp downs of the adjudication decision, and there is 0 allocation for CalAm in this system through their 3 satellite systems. However, it is recognized that there is a mechanism to take care of this with an interconnection on the way to the main system, and that we know that the demand for the year will be about 300 acre feet for the whole system. And the average use for the different months are listed below at the bottom of the table to show that we are going to produce this water, and we realize there's no allocation for it. And the recommendation would be to adopt the proposed water budget, a strategy for CalAm and Laguna Seca's water systems, distribution systems for that should say second quarter of water year 2020, the January through March 2020 period.
Directors, any questions?
I have one question, please.
Director Riley?
On your ASR Table 13 chart, I'm just trying to get a sense of the time of year certain things happen. The pumping out of the upper Carmel River, is that only a wintertime activity?
It's an activity that is has associated flows with it. So there's the bridge that's at Garland Park, the Don Juan Bridge, and if you have 5 consecutive days of flow that are below 20 cubic feet per second, you enter into what's called the low flow period, and this is one of the state board orders. And during the low flow period, the upper valley wells are only allowed to pump to test them and to sample them, but not as sources to the system. So then it is winter time when usually the flows come up, but you can have droughts where you don't receive the flows. When the flows go back above 20 cubic feet per second, you're able to move up, mobilize, and start using the upper valley wells as sources.
Is this kind of like a week-to-week activity? Kind of?
It depends on if the river is entering and leaving the low flow by going 20 and then getting some rain and coming back up. And there have been times when it's acted like that, but that's not as common.
Okay, thank you.
Any other directors? Okay, then I'll open up this item for public comment. Anyone wishing to speak on this item? Okay, seeing none, we'll bring it back to the board for discussion.
Move approval.
Second?
Okay, we have a motion from Director Edwards and a second from Director Byrne. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. And we'll move on to item number 11. What is item number 11? To receive the fiscal year 2018-19 comprehensive annual financial report.
Good evening, Chair, members of the board. This is the annual financial report. We do have staff members from Hayashi Wellen, Ray Galati, Emelissa Santiago, and Mike Bradley in the other room. which they will cover the second part of this presentation. Just wanted to highlight a couple of things. One of them is there was 2 exhibits to the staff note. One of them was the actual CAFR report, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. The other attachment was the board disclosure letter that is written by the auditors. That is a communication to the board itself, and the audit team will go over those letters. There were also 6 pages of changes to the actual CAFR report, which is included in the handouts that were given with the presentation. So those 6 pages just needs to be replaced to the original board packet. Those were numbers that did not change the audit report itself, but those were some cosmetic changes that we figured out over the weekend. So there are some terminologies in this audit report that I'd like to highlight. One of them is the GASB, and GASB is basically the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. Those are the folks that basically set out the governmental accounting auditing standards. And so basically, I've described what GASB is, when they were formed. I won't read that, but just for your clarification, that's what GASB is. What is a CAFR? CAFR is basically a set of governmental financial statements, and that comprises of a couple of sections. I'll cover those sections in next slides. And then the standards that we receive to prepare the CAFR, it's actually put out by GASB. And so those are the standards that we have to follow in order to come up with the CAFR report. CAFR is compiled by the governmental accounting staff. That's basically what the requirement is, that we have to get the CAFR prepared. And then the CAFR is made up of 3 sections. One of them is the introductory section, then it's the financial section, and then there's the statistical section, which covers 10 years of history relative to the financial statements. So those are the 3 major sections of the CAFR. And the way it's outlined in our CAFR, you'll see the introductory sections are the Roman numerals from I to IX, which covers the letter of transmittal by the district. Also covers our CAFR award from last year, which was for fiscal year ending June 30th, 2018. Also comprises of how the specific government is structured. The next section, which is the financial section, pages 1 to 49, it has the auditor's opinion in there. It has the MD&A, or referred to as management's discussion analysis, written by the agency. And then it has the basic financial statements, also includes the notes itself, and then the last part of it from pages 50 to 71, that's the statistical section. Those are the historical trends that's outlined in this CAFR report. We got it audited by Hershey Whelan. They've been our auditors for, I want to say, since 1989. One of the reasons is because they know our interlink between us and the reclamation project. Basically, reclamation project is a component unit. That's the Pebble Beach Reclamation Unit, and I'll talk more about it as we go into the financial statements. But they have been on the auditing partner for the agency, and so they understand how it all works and how it's all done for the district. We have gone out for RFPs in the past, and every time we've gone out for RFPs, they've come out with a better pricing, and so the board has decided to choose them every time we do the RFP. And the last RFP was done about 5 years ago, so I believe this is the last year of the 3-year contract. Second year. So after the 3rd year, we have a 3-year contract. After the 3rd year, we will go out for another RFP, and then we'll see what the results are for that. We did get a unmodified, which is actually the clean opinion from the auditors. There was no material findings, and you'll see it's highlighted in the CAFR report, and they will also highlight as well. There was no instances of non-compliance. They went through the books, and we followed our governmental auditing standards. So basically, there was no findings. As I mentioned on the CAFR award, this was the 4th year in fiscal year ending June 30th, 2018 that we got the award. The plaque is on the wall with the button there. And we feel that our current CAFR is worthy of another award, so we will be sending it again to GFOA for a 5th-year award. So we'll see how that goes. It takes them 6 months to reply and let us know whether we qualify for the award or not. I'll get into the The 70-page CAFRA, basically, I'm just hitting on the summary notes here, and one of the things you'll note, all of my slides that has numbers, it does have a reference to the CAFRA itself. So like, for example, statement of net position, which is governmental-wide, you'll see that the detail of this is reported on page 12 of the actual CAFRA report. The governmental-wide basically covers the governmental activities, which is the left column. On the district's activities, the business-type activities is the Pebble Beach Reclamation Project, and we are on the hook on the debt for the Pebble Beach Reclamation Project, and that's why we have to report them as a component unit. The loan is in our name, so it does show up on financial statements, and that's the reason why we have to report them as a component unit. Total assets for the district, $25.9 million, and then the reclamation project, 43. So the total assets for the district was a little shy of $70 million. Total liabilities were about $28 million. So all in all, the total net position for the district and the Pebble Beach reclamation project was $41.6 million. Looking at the balance sheet for just the governmental fund, which is again just the agency itself, district itself, then we are doing a comparative numbers here. Again, the full detail on this one can be found on page 14. Total assets for the district itself, 2018 was 14.9, 2019 was 17.9. We gained a little, about $3 million position there, and that's because we had some deferred projects that were not completed in fiscal year ending 19. Total liabilities for the district compared to last year, 809,000, deferred inflows. So the total fund balance position for the district compared to 2018 was a little over $17 million. So as I had mentioned, the $3 million over on the fund balance side. And there's more slides that'll show or get into the detail for that. Total revenue for the district, again, comparing to the 2018, we had about 14.2. Slight decrease there from 17.6. If you recall, in 2018 fiscal year financial statements, we received $4.2 million loan reimbursement from, or not loan, but project reimbursement from our partners, Monterey Water. So we did not get that in this year. So that's the reason for the decline in revenues. Total expenditures, little over than 2018. We did some projects there. We did the San Carlos restoration projects, which was about $800,000. We did the Sleepy Hollow project. We did a couple of other projects, ASR backflush expansion, all of those projects. So total expenditures were a little higher than 2018. And our end of the year fund balance from $14 million did increase to $17 million, and that's simply because we had about $3 million of project expenditures that were not carried out this year that in 2019 were carried out in, or will be carried out in 2020. Explaining the revenues, the district revenues, how they are categorized, you'll see about 75% of our revenues come from either user fee, water supply charge, or property tax, and then the rest of them are just small numbers made up there. And then explaining those same numbers on the expenditure side, you'll see about close to 50% of it goes towards project expenditures, about 33% towards personnel, and then some of the other categories, the smaller item, less than 10% categories. And all of these, again, are captured on page 15 of the CAFRA report. Looking at the statement of revenues, expenditures for the district, and now we are comparing budget to actual for the year ending 2019. So you'll see our total revenues were right about in line, about $400,000 more than what we had expected. Our total expenditures were about 14.8 as compared to $11 million. Were $11 million as compared to 14.8. And then we had budgeted that we were going to use about $180,000 from our reserves. That did not happen to be the case. We actually banked $2.9 million in the reserves. And simply because this is not, this is just expenses coming in lower than the revenues because we did not do some of those projects that I had mentioned. One of the big ticket items was the ASR expansion project. So our end of year fund balance, $17 million as opposed to $13.9, which was budgeted. Pension and OPEB liabilities, there's about 7 pages of detailed OPEB, which is other post-employment benefits, and then pension-related information. I've just captured them here in a very summary slide. Oops. A detailed report on OPEB and pension will come to this board next month, and we will explain in detail how the position for the pension and the OPEB has changed. But looking at what's in the financial statements, you'll see beginning of the year balance on the OPEB and pension were 9.3. Change in obligations for the year, about 350,000. So end of the year, what's recorded in the financial statements are $9.6 million. And that's how the number is made up of. So staff recommends board receive the fiscal year comprehensive annual financial report, but before that, we'd like to have the auditing team give a brief presentation, then we'll go from there.
Good evening. So we just have what we've done in the past, have done a brief overview of some of the required disclosures that we're supposed to make to the board. Since Suresh has already gone over the numbers, we won't go into the numbers, but if there's any questions on the financials, we definitely will welcome questions. So this is just a reminder that really the objective of an audit is to determine whether the financial statements are materially correct. And so we audited in accordance with generally accepted auditing principles. And the goal would obviously be to receive an unmodified opinion, and that is what we issued, an unmodified opinion, previously called a clean opinion. So that's the highest level of service that an organization can receive as an audit, and that's the best opinion that you can get on your audit results. In your packet, Suresh referred to a board disclosure letter, and this really right here is a summary of all of the major components of that letter. So without having to read every paragraph, we're just required to disclose to you what the significant accounting policies are of the district. There weren't any new ones that were adopted this year that were significant. We didn't have any what we would call significant or unusual transactions that we didn't have authority or guidance to know how to record and process. The accounting estimates that are in the financial statements are reasonable. And one thing that we do have to make clear to the board is that we did make some audit adjustments. So this would be, how do the numbers differ from reports that you may be getting on an interim basis? And so we had a few journal entries that we made that decreased your net position by about $95,000. It was really some timing on project reimbursements, taking one that had been accrued from last year off the books and maybe accruing a new one. And then we also have to make some of those final pension and OPEB journal entries. And overall, that decreased the net position by $500,000. The pension liability that Suresh highlighted on his slide was about $350,000 was the liability, but ours is net of those deferred inflows and outflows, which are also on the financial statements. So like I said, if you have questions on that, we can go into it, but there's a lot of detail in the footnotes about the pension and OPEB notes. We didn't find any uncorrected misstatements. We're required to just let you know that we didn't have any disagreements with management, or we weren't aware of any consultations that management had with other accounting firms to come up with an opinion. No real issues discussed prior to retaining us as auditors, and no significant difficulties in performing the audit. So the next best piece is that as far as our internal control recommendations, that we found no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies. So that's also the best outcome you can get when we review internal controls and the processes and procedures that are in place to account for all the financial transactions. Which leads us into, oops, did I hit the wrong button? Because it went off. I just hit the arrow. That we did not have any current year internal control recommendations for improvement. And there actually were no prior year recommendations last year either. I think we've had really minor things that we may mention when we're during the audit, but nothing that actually comes up at all to the level of requiring disclosure to the board or to the public. Another piece that's also in the letter, and it's also in the financial statements in more detail, is any new accounting standards that are going to be coming up that have not yet been implemented but may impact the district. And there's 4 of them listed. And to be honest, the only one that may or impact the district is the lease standard. And it probably won't be as significant to the district as it is if you hear it out in the public. There's a lot of organizations that have a lot of leases, and all leases now are going to be on the balance sheet. Whereas, often now they're being expensed. But I don't think that the district has any real significant material leases that will be impacted. that we don't have any plans to early implement them, and we always have to just do a standard disclosure. We haven't evaluated the effect that the adoption will have on the statements. The only items that are open for us to actually release the report in final is we get some attorney letters, so we just get an opinion from legal counsel and any other attorneys that have been consulted through the year to make sure there aren't any subsequent events or legal matters that need to be disclosed. Suresh will complete his response to the GFOA and submit the report and the application to get the CAFRA award again. And then as a follow-up, we file it's kind of what you would call a tax return, if you term to use it. The state controller's report is due at the end of January, and we'll prepare that based on the audit results once those have been finalized. And I want to say that's where I just open it up to if there's any questions. And I have a copy of the CAFR if there is any questions on any specific sections or items.
Any questions, directors?
I have a question of discussion time.
Very well, you have a question. And do we have any questions at this time? All right. Well, stick around.
All right.
So we'll open this item up to public comment, if anyone would like to comment. Seeing none, then we'll bring it back to the board for discussion. And your question, Director Riley?
Let me get recorded. I've had some, it's not a concern, it's just kind of an information gap, I think, in my brain, or maybe it's my sequential thinking that doesn't connect. Anyway, I have two kinds of questions that I don't know if it's possible to do this, and it's not an auditing thing, but it's kind of an information thing about how things are presented. It seems to me the wide range of $2, $3, $4 million between various accounts that we just heard about is largely based on projects that either receive reimbursements or don't, or get delayed 1 year or not. And what I'm trying to do is understand more about what our operating level is as a district without the project or the grant kind of transaction all mixed together. And I'm wondering if there's a way to present an operating budget, and maybe it's just for information only, and I'm not sure how to do this, and have as a separate accounting system or information system for us. The kind of tracking between grant revenues, which come late, expenditures come early, there are matching requirements that come sooner or later, there are carryover issues that just situationally, decisions are made around situations. They're just kind of erratic, I think, cash flow arrangements. I'm not saying anything wrong, it's just that how do you track all that? To me, when you track that in the same calculation for the operations of the district, it gets very confusing to me. And I'm just wondering if there's a way to break out, and I'm not trying to define it yet, but at some point, is there a way to break that out so that we see that accounting differently? Because it's not a management structure so much, it's just this cycle of reserves or prepayments or reimbursements or whatever. But it doesn't affect the operations of the district. And I'm just wondering if there's a way that the accounting system might accommodate some clarity along those lines. So,
Well, the short answer is yes. Probably more likely in the budget cycle than in the financial statements, because we're going to conform to financial standards for this. But we've often had that same kind of discussion. Absent your projects, what's the normal cost of operating this district? And we've been called on to answer that question from time to time, so I think it's probably good to revisit it. The second piece, the grant reimbursements or the company reimbursements or the failure to complete a project in the budget year that you budgeted for it and raised money for it, it's a little more complex. We try to do that every year when we show you what's been carried over that we're going to have to spend on. But yeah, I think we'll come up with something. You got something there?
Yeah, I was just going to add that actually the budget, if you look at the budget on the revenue side, the pages, it is broken out by what the district revenues are, what the reimbursement revenues are, and then the interfund transfers are. So basically the budget has those categories. And when we report on the quarterly financial statements, We could break it out how the budget is actually, so that you have the district revenues and the reimbursements and all that. That's the only missing link we probably have is on the quarterly financials. We don't separate those out, but we can follow the same process that we do for the budget, and we would be able to break those out for you.
Yeah, and if I could, I'd just like to meet with you sometime and try to get an understanding.
Yeah,
and-
we can
and so
easily
my
do that.
questions get clarified. Okay. Thank you.
Any other directors? Okay.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, we,
Speaking on the second, if I may, I want to tell the staff and our auditors, good job. One thing I liked about what you did tonight, you explained why 1989 been a big number, because I was about to question you on that, and you cleared that all up, so you must have been knowing what I was thinking. I appreciate that, because when you carry an auditor about 30 years, hey, they got to be doing something right. And looking at the forms, I see red in here, I see corrections, what she said. So I want to say thank you. Thank you for the good job that y'all been doing. Now, you know, it might have to go back out there to be looked at with some other auditors. So that's in the future. But I hope we get another award this year, too. Because if we don't, we'll be looking. Not threatening you, just telling you. Thank you.
done. All right, so we have a motion to accept the report from Director Edwards and a second, and a second from Director Riley. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much for your presentation and for the work that you've done. Okay, we'll move on to item number 12, the action item. Consider authorization of additional consulting and legal work in advance of a resolution of necessity.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's 5 aspects to this staff note. I guess what I want to remind the public as well as the board that this is not a vote to move forward with a condemnation action or to agree that we're, as a district, going to try to acquire CalAm. This is an authorization of additional work after the finding that on November 12th that the acquisition appears to be economically feasible or financially feasible, which was, a crucial piece of the initiative. Then we began to discuss among the team what else might be needed so that you can make the most informed decision you possibly can, whether to continue to move forward. And that stems around these following areas. One is a formal appraisal, and I've combined rate study, but they're really 2 separate things, but let's talk about each of them. The formal appraisal would take what you saw as the assumed value or the calculated value and both polish that number up and make certain key policy decisions about some of the add-ons. If you remember, that here's what the value is, and then here's regulatory assets, it's an add-on. Here's tank painting, it's an add-on. Here's amortization of acquisition premium as an add-on. Some of those add-ons that we considered may or may not actually be part of a settlement with a jury through the condemnation proceeding. So your first price, your first offer on a house needs to be what you believe a bona fide offer is for the value of the system. So we'd be honing in on that. We valued land based on information we could pull together with a consultant, but now you'd want to get an MAI appraiser in there, and you would want this appraisal to follow MAI appraisal standards. So it's a polishing of that $513 million number because that would be the offer. The rate study component has 2 aspects to it, and that is given where rates are today under an investor-owned utility framework, can those rates be maintained under a Prop 218 world? We think not, that there'd have to be some consideration given to the issues surrounding public rate setting versus investor-owned utility rate setting. And so based on a couple of potential foreseeable rate structures before an acquisition, what would rates look like after the acquisition? That's something that we'd want you to know. And then the other piece of it is, it's been stated already publicly, and we disagree, that we would not be in a position to offer a low-income assistance program. We believe we can, and consistent with Proposition 218, we've already done some work on that. So we would want the consultant to also cover that. So Reftelis does rate studies, does the appraisal work. The goal of the attorneys, well, we actually did have a call with your general counsel and with the eminent domain attorneys. They would like to continue with Reftelis leading the formal appraisal work rather than supporting some other formal appraiser. So that's what this recommendation is. That's sole sourcing. They did provide a scope of work in Exhibit 12A that you can look at in a little greater detail. And the budget is approximately $235,000 for that. The next area are the findings and other legal work related to some of the other aspects. Findings are in effect, and you've adopted findings before for new ordinances. You know, here's your findings, and based on the findings, you hereby do this, that, or the other thing. And so in this case, these would be findings of why it's in the public interest. These are the findings of public necessity, and that would go to operations and governance and transparency and why it's really in the public interest. And this will be a pretty heavy lift of the eminent domain attorneys and DeLay and Laredo, mostly legal work, but a lot of research into PUC documents and other sources of information. And that budget came in at $225,000. I can tell you, based on what Suresh and I learned with the hourly rates of the attorneys, we came in under budget. And remember the $650,000 for the first phase. We're slightly under, but we were surprisingly over with the attorneys. So I think, and this is more legal work here, one would imagine. So we're cautious, but that's the budget they gave us. Their budget is not included as an appendix or an exhibit because there was legal strategy in there as well that would affect the negotiation. On the operations plan, we've, in the cost of service study, looked at this as both an integrated approach where all of the California American employees come over and bring that knowledge. But in the event that those employees aren't available, we also looked at third-party contract operations. This is a very arcane area for water and wastewater. There aren't that many firms who do it. Some examples are Jacobs, Veolia, Suez, and others. And the idea would be to have an operations plan. I think we kind of skew towards looking at an integrated approach where the employees would come over. If it's, you know, if it's in the public interest and you head down this path, that would be the approach we want to. But you have to be prepared for that not happening. And so we would like you to see what it looks like, what the risk allocation is between the district, the operator. If there's another operator just doing the desal plant, like in IDE, then there'd be water quality issues between the two third-party operators. And so we need to kind of spec all that out. Close and Associates, who've worked in the first phase, put a scope of work in here. And then we've been talking to Jacobs as kind of a, an industry source. And given the timeline, what we'd like to do is just sole source them for the unique professional services aspect of this, knowing that they would still have to compete for the business among all the other potential third-party operators out there if it ever got to that stage. And then finally, and so there's two pieces to the operations plan because one's third-party and one's integration, so it's those two parties. And then finally, CEQA work. What we propose here for CEQA is to actually bundle all of our CEQA needs for the next year or two together and go out to the street and see who can offer what we're looking for. We did speak to industry professionals to try to get an estimate. I think it's relatively high. I went back into the emails and between a couple of the attorneys, they think that there's an approach to the acquisition. So there's two pieces to this. One is LAFCO, the boundary, and we think that that can be done as a notice of exemption, but we'll have to talk to general counsel how how deep, what layers of responsibility we want to take on, but that's a relatively affordable piece. The budget of 275 to 475,000 was based on a full-blown CEQA, and we do believe that there's, if we do better at describing specifically what we think needs to be done, I don't know, I think hand-wavingly, we just figured out that there might not, that it might be self-mitigating, so we might be able to do a mitigated negative deck instead of a full-blown EIR, which would be in the tens of thousands of dollars rather than, maybe 100 instead of, 400. But that would reveal itself with the RFQ process because we'd have bids in hand. So that's the proposal. I think $1.2 million is a scary number. Based on what I've just told you about the sequel work, I believe it would be well under that, but it's still a significant number. I was asked by one of the directors today where we budgeted for that, and I was honest, thin air. All through this process, we didn't budget before the election for a successful election. We didn't budget for post-feasibility study work, assuming that it was going to prove to be feasible. We didn't want to make any judgments about outcomes, and so we know we've just been, doing this based on reserves and then fixing it at the mid-year budget adjustment time, which is what we would do in this case as well. But you'd be budgeting this basically from reserves. The last presentation shows you that we're in a pretty solid financial position right now. We have sufficient monies to do that. But if you want to get to the point where you've got the most informed decision that you can make, these are the things we think you still need.
So I have a question. So these numbers, as I've sort of quizzed you before, are going to be part of the cost of it being feasible.
Correct.
So instead of 513, we're at 514, 515 something.
Right, and so in that 513, we were actually carrying several $1 million worth of out-of-pocket expenses as if we were going to reimburse ourselves. So it's in the number right now so that when it gets converted to debt and thrown into the cost of service, it's as if these costs are already in it. You'll make a decision at that point in the future whether you want to reimburse yourself or if you just want to say, okay, the offer is 508 and we've spent 4, so it's really 513. But yeah, we're tracking all of these because they're real costs of the transaction. I was telling somebody today, back in around 2000, 2002, I helped the city of Stockton sell a landfill because they were trying to stave off bankruptcy. And in order to do that, we had to get consulting engineers in to do the design and advancing some cells so that the asset actually had value, could take some more waste so that an outside company would want it. We had a law firm. I was doing some of the financial work. And that was the year 2000, and it was about $1.2 million to $1.4 million of consulting work just to get it to the position where it could be put out to bid to a private waste hauler. These things aren't cheap, and it's at the end of the day, it's if you don't do it, it's just money that was spent on information that may or may not ever have a purpose, but they are not cheap.
Do you have a guesstimate on what it would cost to do the initial trial?
Yeah, so I actually put a slide up on the screen at the November 12th.
Right.
Yeah, and I can't recall it, but I think we were talking 2 to 4 to 5 million through the bench trial, depending on how many expert witnesses we need and how bad it gets. But we're not there yet. We may not have 5 votes. We may have some queasiness after we see this work and say, well, it's not as easy as we thought. Don't know.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate your comment that in order for us to be able to do due diligence, this is information that we should have, and I appreciate that very much. Just wondering, do all of these, do you expect this full 1.2 million to be needed in the next 6 months? Or would we spread it over 2 budget years?
Yeah,
or
it's a
how
great
would that
question.
work?
It'll end up being spread over 2 budget years. If we stay on the schedule, I know there's some board members who would like to accelerate. I don't think we're in a position to accelerate because the work that has to get done and the findings need to be perfect, or you're going to make a decision based on findings, and those findings better look exactly like what you would take to the bench trial, or very close. There may be other things that get learned through discovery and so forth. But so you just really need to know. I would say probably about 2/3 would be in this budget year, and the last invoices for everybody would be in the next budget year.
Any other questions from directors?
Just a couple of them, and then we get out here to the public. Water rights. I read in here that you wanted to wait. Is there money in here to look at that when it comes?
That's a great question, because we also interviewed firms that can do water rights valuation. And we've got kind of a twofold series of arguments around water rights, which were revealed in the first phase, so I think we can talk about them. Appropriative water rights through the state board have a specific language about what their value is if they're transferred or sold. So what we're really talking about would be other water rights, pre-1914, riparian, and/or groundwater rights, and then they can be valued in a variety of different fashions, not the least of which is what's the alternative. If you have to build a new supply, or is there a contractual rate that water's being offered at, and so forth. So there are ways to actually do that work. The team, though, the eminent domain attorneys and Reftelis, devalued the cost approach to such a standard of 0, saying that never do these acquisitions come out anywhere near the cost approach. So they want to weight that as 0. When during the campaign, Cal-Am came out with an appraisal that was made public, the cost approach was heavily weighted, and water rights had a significant add-on to that. What the attorneys have said is, if you're not going to value the cost approach, which is the only one where water rights would be separately valued, because in an income approach where it's just, what's the value of my enterprise, think of it as a business, well, your water rights are already in there. And when you value it based on a comparable sales, that transaction, their water rights were part of it. So you're valuing it based on already included. And so their conclusion was, if you're not valuing the cost approach, don't spend money on valuing water rights. And if you got all the way to the jury trial and water rights is becoming an important part, then go get your expert witness to value them then, because what you're doing at that point in time is, here's what our witness believes, here's what their witness believes, and hopefully you've got a smart enough jury to say, well, yeah, it looks like that. So that's kind of the approach, long-winded approach.
Okay, with the CEQA review, how much do we need for Measure J, and how much do we need for the rest of the district, like for allocation, EIRs?
Right.
And
So
how long?
Yeah, so this
How long?
estimate was just on what they thought was needed for the LAFCO piece and the acquisition piece
Okay.
of Measure J. We think they wildly overestimated, and we're going to hone in on that. We're contemplating taking CEQA back on water credit transfers.
Yeah.
If that's going to be a tool we'll use in the next 3 to 4 years to help with housing, for example. And then the allocation EIR, which may or may not be separate from the environmental program that we run on the river, because the allocation of water may be different than revamping your mitigation program now that you've got a new water supply. So, but we spec all that out over the December holidays and early January and try to get something out on the street in January.
Now, 2 questions right fast. How long is this data good for? That first part we just did, I know that's probably yearly because they change, new reports. How long is this data that we're about to gather now is going to be useful?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say the stuff that we just got, the data we just got in November, is good for a while. What changes is with each passing year, the value of regulatory assets, as an example. So right now, remember all the under collections due to conservation and so forth. And then the Public Utilities Commission came back and said, well, we're going to allow you to recover that now, and you can recover it over a certain period of time. And so, and another example would be San Clemente Dam as a regulatory asset. Remember, they were allowed to recover. Excuse me. And so there's these either balancing accounts or regulatory assets that have value, but with each passing year, a piece of that goes away. And so if you're going to make an offer and say, gosh, it's going to take us 4 years before we get there, well, you're probably going to include in your offer, you're going to take 4 years of that kind of stuff out. Or by the time we actually get to the purchase, all of the revenue adjustment mechanism monies for that under collection will have been collected, so it's gone now too. So the snapshot in time that you got included a lot of things currently in time. So if you figure it's the value of the system plus all these add-ons, the value of the system is not going to change very much. It's the value of the add-ons that changes, give or take 2 to 3 years. So what you want to do is have a single bona fide offer that represents your best guess of what the price is based on what you're seeing today, but shaded a little bit for when you think the transaction will actually close.
Okay.
So,
Mr.
yeah.
Mr. Laredo, if we said no to this tonight, when could it come back up again? Are we done with it? Or do our new rule say the next board could bring it back up? I think that needs to be cleared up.
There's no inhibition of bringing a proposal back at some future time. It could be this board, it could be a future board. Measure J doesn't speak to that. The question is, what will have changed? Why would you bring it back once you've had a definitive vote? So there has to be some rationale for that.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Any other questions from directors? Okay, bring your mic down.
In the report, and it's under the findings and other legal work, I think it's the very last line, there's make a reference to if a writ to gain access is to be filed. The question is trying to get site visits to understand the condition of the infrastructure or the operating efficiencies or whatever you can find out. Is that discovery, is discovery different than this suggestion here?
Now, discovery is kind of a generic term. It would have to meet a very specific application to the court for an inspection warrant. The civil code does allow an inspection warrant if it's needed. Just have to lay out why access to private property is needed, and the court would authorize the warrant if it is. But in the larger sense, it is a form of discovery.
Yeah,
Okay.
but that precedes the actual filing of a condemnation action or lawsuit. Once you actually file, so let's say you went through the steps. You said, okay, everything I've seen, I really want to do this. You make an offer. If the offer is rejected, then you decide how badly you want it, and you're going to go take it by condemnation. Once you file that action in the courts, you will have a right of entry, and it'll get scheduled, and it'll be uncomfortable for everybody, but you will have a right. So this writ gets you that right in advance of the condemnation.
Because it's targeted specifically to certain
The district would just need to
characteristics or
make a
something.
showing as to why do we need this information at this time.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Then I would like to open this up to public comment. And if you're in the front room and would like to speak, I suggest you come in and get in line. Unless nobody wants to speak.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Anna Thompson. I live in Carmel. I urge you to please proceed with the next phase of preparing for the buyout and spending the money to do it. I'm convinced that for many reasons, community ownership of the water is always better than private ownership, especially in the long run. There are 3 reasons which I consider to be the most significant ones. Reason number 1, it's always cheaper to pay for a product at cost than paying a cost plus profit. We must also consider the costs for future repairs and/or system improvements will be higher under private ownership, and that because of inflation, those costs and profits will continue to go up, not down. In 2016, CalAm collected approximately $60 million in revenue from the customers. Approximately $90 million was spent on corporate profit and taxes. All of those profits and corporate taxes leave our community. CalAm's parent company is domiciled in New Jersey, not in California. The approximate $340,000 property taxes that CalAm currently pays could still continue to be paid under the public ownership. So what do we have to gain with private ownership that justifies the millions in profit we pay every year? In my view, this is truly money down the drain for us. Reason number 2, instead of paying CalAm all those millions in profits, why don't we invest this money to purchase CalAm? Yes, the rates might not be significantly lower at first, but with each payment we make, our financial liability will be reduced. It's like purchasing your own home. Instead of renting, even if the amount of rent is less than the mortgage and the taxes at the time of the purchase, it will still be a great investment. Because of inflation, the rent will continue to go up, but the house mortgage will eventually be paid off. Purchasing CalAm will be very beneficial to the long-term growth and prosperity of our community. Reason number 3, which is my opinion is the most important of them all, local control. Approximately 85% of water consumers in the United States receive their service from public agencies. Water is the most precious resource for all life everywhere. It shouldn't be under the control of a monopoly. CalAm's interests are in conflict with what is best for our communities. Public ownership of our water system will afford transparency in meetings and actions by governing bodies, assure public access to records, and ensure full accountability of local elected officials in water system management and operations. Please, I urge you to proceed with the next phase of preparing for the buyout and spending the money to do it. Thank you so very much for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson.
Greetings, members of the board. My name is Paul Bruno. I'm a resident of unincorporated Monterey. We're headed down a path, and we're actually headed down a path a lot quicker and a lot more expensive than I ever thought. This free study that we talked about, and I spoke at the last meeting, it was supposed to be a free study. Well, we budgeted $650,000 so far, and tonight we're looking at another 1.2 million, bringing us to about 1.89 million budgeted. 1.89 million budgeted, and we haven't taken a vote yet, any vote whatsoever. Think about it. I read the report here. It says summary. November 12th, a public workshop related to Rule 19.8 Measure J concluded that the acquisition of CalAm's water system is economically feasible. Apparently, the public workshop concluded that. This board didn't conclude it. I read the minutes. I didn't see any conclusion by this board. This board has said nothing. You've had some experts come in. They presented some numbers. They presented numbers that are double what was said in the campaign. They presented numbers that didn't have all the information. They had no severance liability. They presented you a partial picture. Nobody's concluded it's feasible, but you can conclude it's not feasible. We're at double what was said in the campaign, with things being left out. So are you really ready to spend $2 million, upwards of $2 million on this study? Because that's what you're saying. You're heading down the path. You're just going down the path. So why don't we have that vote? Why don't we say, do we have 5 votes tonight to continue this? I know it's not before us that way, but it really should be. If you don't have 5 votes right now, you're wasting $2 million. Or excuse me, you're wasting another 1.2 million. You're already wasted 600,000. So think about that. Are you really prepared to spend this money on something that we know has been incomplete? The numbers at, 600 million? That's not complete. Doesn't have everything in it. This is becoming a bottomless pit. And where's the money coming from? Well, we're going to budget from reserves. Okay, well, that's nice, but I also heard that we had a $9.6 million unfunded pension liability. Well, why don't we fund that from reserves? If we have all these great reserves, let's go ahead and fund that. Because that's real. We have employees who have worked for years who have an unfunded pension liability. If we have an extra $2 million, let's pay that down. But the truth is, you don't have an extra $2 million. You don't have $2 million for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bruno.
Madam Chair, may I comment on something that Mr. Bruno said, or would you rather have that be at the end?
I would like you to hold it till the end.
I will do so.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the council, my name is Rick Hoyer, here on behalf of the Maui Peninsula Taxpayers Association. Yeah, we've been hearing ever since the last report was put out, it's feasible, it's feasible. Well, today we're finding out, well, it's being called feasible, but you don't have an appraisal. It's being called feasible, but you don't have an operating plan. You're having to spend another $1.2 million for part of that. Until you have that information, you don't know if it's feasible. So let's stop talking nonsense. The other thing is, as Mr. Bruno, we're headed down the path. You're going to be spending $2 million. Maybe you end up voting not to move forward. You flush $2 million down the toilet. You end up going forward, and if you lose in court, as happened in Claremont, you've got a whole lot more money going down the toilet too. I think it's a rather appropriate term given we are the water board and we're actually trying to have sewer water be converted to water for us. But it was interesting that the comment made earlier about you need to paddle down the middle of the river. That was a great one. And if you start paddling too fast down the middle of the river, if you're not careful and you're not looking out, you're going to go right over the waterfall at the end of that river. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyer.
Melody Crislock, Public Water Now. We've come a long ways. I was just sitting there thinking about 2013 when public ownership of our water system was just Public Water Now's vision. Thank you so much for bringing it full circle to a feasible reality. This has been voted on. 24,000 people voted on this, saying, yes, do this. Measure J really requires you to move forward. And talking about spending $1.2 million, we have to keep that in perspective. CalAm has on our bills right now $35 million in failed projects. Do we want more money in failed projects, or do we want to spend $1.2 million and get out from underneath this private ownership of our water system? You can move forward with the confidence of the community behind you. This was 56% of the vote. In most situations, that's considered quite a landslide. So I don't think you need to worry about moving forward and finding out what you need to do and making a really good offer to CalAm. And I hope you will do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crislock.
Good evening, Board. My name is Sam Teal. I'm a resident of Pacific Grove, California. My problem is with the feasibility issue. Mr. Stoltz has said that nobody has questioned his supply figures, and that's really not true. They were questioned in 2018 by this PUC. And a lot of the numbers that he came up with disagree with those numbers. In reality, his numbers are considerably below what the PUC uses for their supply numbers. And this goes to feasibility. Are we going to go ahead with this and spend another $1.2 million with this kind of shoddy figures? You need to nail this down. You need to get it right before you proceed forward. One of the issues that came up at the PUC was whether or not you could use reclaimed water as a substitute for the desal. And they emphatically said no, it was not a good substitute. You couldn't do it. And at this point, M1 has not decided whether they could do that or not. That should come up very soon. But relying on that as a substitute for a desal plant won't work. Saying that, oh great, we don't have to buy the desal plant, therefore it's more feasible, is really not a very good way to proceed forward either. So I ask you tonight to consider very clearly that you need to go back to that feasibility study and say, let's see what it looks like with different demand numbers, because those were not correct. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'm Jeff Davy, a lifelong third-generation resident of the Monterey Peninsula. Speaking to you personally tonight, members of the board, thank you for having us. This issue, I just want to clarify, the vote that took place at the ballot box was for this board to study this and determine its feasibility, and that's what you've been doing. So that's not the vote that decides if we decide to buy Cal-Am. It's going to fall into your hands. And this is a real estate transaction when you really boil it down to it. And all the things you've heard about the process. It's also a pretty ugly one when it comes to condemnation. And if you think about condemnation, if you've ever experienced it or been involved in it, I would ask you to remember how that went. And I think there is, I don't know if Mr. Potter was involved with the City of Monterey's condemnation on Window to the Bay, but you know, what they wanted to buy those properties for on Del Monte and what they ultimately paid were a lot different. But that's just the way condemnation is. When you have an unwilling seller and a willing buyer, you're going to pay more than you expect. So like I said last month, just remember that. The numbers might look good, but you've got to analyze and understand they're going to go up. How high are they going to go? That's going to be the unknown, but you've got to anticipate that. And in light of that, I thought the process that was outlined originally, I'm just kind of questioning it, was that we were going to present this last month, probably make a vote this month or something. I understand that things change, but it seems to me that you ought to take the temperature of the board at some point before you embark on another $1.2 million to spend in this direction. And as I've said before, if you need that vote a year from now to be a supermajority, I personally think you ought to look for that now. Because if you don't, you're forcing this to go forward without knowing you have the votes to really pull it off, even if it turns out to be feasible. So just caution you about all of that. It's not a simple process. You've got a lot of work ahead of you and a tough decision to make, but I do think you ought to at least find out where you are in terms of direction before you spend the $1.2 million. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davy.
Hello, Brenda Lewis, Seaside resident. I just wanted to say that I echo the opinions of Ms. Thompson and Ms. Krizlak. $1.2 million is a drop in the bucket compared to what Cal-Am overcharges us every year. I urge this board and Mr. Stolt to stay the course and to follow the will of the majority of the voters who voted for Measure J and want this study. You're doing a wonderful job. Hang in there. Stand firm. We're behind you.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis.
Dan Turner, Monterey. There's an old Hebrew proverb that men make plans and God laughs. Still, I got a plan. And my plan is to live in my house until I die. And then pass it on to my children, who may want to live here at some point in the future. Now, I don't know when I'm going to die. Could be tomorrow, might not be for 20 years, who knows? And I might have a long, lingering death, might have to sell a house to pay for my medical expenses. But if I don't, the kids take over 20 years from now, what a difference it's going to be in water costs depending on what you people do. We will be paying more by a factor of, I don't know, 2, 3, or 4 if we stay with Cal-Am as opposed to going to a public agency. Also, as previous speakers said, you better have 5 votes right now or else. Well, I tell you, Supposing you only have 4 votes now, and supposing you still only have 4 votes when you go for the resolution of necessity later this year. Well, we're going to have an election in November, and if that's the way it turns out, believe me, there's going to be some changes on this board, and a future board will probably look more favorably upon this. Again, Cal-Am has been diabolically clever in turning the community against itself, business people against regular residents. None of the other communities that have gotten rid of a private water company had this problem. This is a really bad thing for the community. I've been talking about this for years. And it falls to each of you to decide whether you are going to prolong this agony, because it's not going to go away. People aren't going to say, oh, well, I guess we have to put up with Cal-Am. No, the fight's going to go on and on and on. So, that's where we stand. The choice is going to be up to you. But don't worry, if you blow it, there'll be another board in a year or so.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Anyone else wishing to speak on this item?
Hello, Merlene Fisher, Carmel. It was pointed out earlier that the community, help me please, that lost their case, Claremont. My understanding is that Claremont did lose that fight, but that they were terribly ill prepared for it in the first place. That they didn't do their due diligence. And I really urge you all to do your due diligence and do as the voters have asked. It is not very expensive compared to the other expenses we're looking forward to otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher.
Chair Evans, other members of the board, Gary Curcio, Monterey Peninsula Hospitality Association. We're talking about an additional $1.24 million, like it's nothing, like it's chump change. $650,000 has been spent. Staff is asking for another $1.24 million in addition. There actually is an alternative that you board members could move forward with before agreeing to spend an additional $1.24 million. Why not complete the robust work in all 4 areas of feasibility that the district promised us earlier? Release it to the public, take public input, and then and only then should we discuss allocating these additional funds and moving forward. Please give that some consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Curcio.
Good evening. My name is Mark Kelly, and I'm a resident of Monterey. What I'd like to address just very briefly is the issue that all of you are dealing with right now, in which your director has given you some input, and that's your user fee and your water supply charge. You all know that it was designed that those 2 fees were not supposed to go on forever. They comprise 34% and 24% of your general fund, respectively. And I would only offer to all of you that before you make a decision on if you're going to move forward with this next phase, without regard to whether it's $1 million or 1.5 or $2 million, you have people who live in this district who are paying you on their property tax bill and they're paying you on their Cal-Am bill. And I would call that opportunistic funding, and maybe makes it a little bit easier to take money out of thin air. But I think before you decide to spend this next amount of money, you need to have a conversation with yourselves and look at some of the recommendations Mr. Stolt gave you a few months ago on your options, and decide whether or not you're going to continue. And if you are, make sure you're clear with the people who are your constituents, that you're going to continue to collect money from them off both their property tax bill and off their CalAm bill. And that was, as you all know, never intended to be a long-term solution. But it makes up a lot of your budget. Between the two of them, it's about 57% of your budget, 34 and 24% respectively, roughly. And I think you need to make a real serious decision about how you're going to proceed with that before you decide to write a check to go forward. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Okay, seeing no other speakers, I'll close public comment and bring it back to the board for discussion.
Madam Chair?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
I
Mr.
just
Laredo,
wanted to
please.
comment, a word of caution, or several words of caution. Several speakers, I believe, invite this board to commit legal error. A premature expression of intent would be legally flawed at this time, and a flawed declaration of intent could also provide grounds to recuse those directors that voted to proceed. What can you do now? The board can vote no. It could pull the plug on this analysis. The board may also decide it wishes to collect more data. But the board cannot express unequivocal support for a resolution of necessity at this time. The board may not legally express unequivocal support for acquisition of the utility at this time. The board is able to take those steps only after first following the CEQA process. And the board also can follow those steps then only after reviewing and adopting specific findings of fact and conclusions of law. And those aren't before you. So I do caution you, you cannot take a poll or a vote on your willingness to proceed at that time. That would be flawed. What is before you is either pulling the plug or deciding to collect more data.
Thank you for the clarification.
Other clarifications just relative to the speakers. It's come up a number of times, but there are gaps. There's no severance. They haven't been privy to all the conversations, but you may recall that we talked about not putting any number on severance because that would be not preconditioning, but it would be exemplary of what we might be willing to pay for or not willing to pay for. And no decision on severance should be made at this point in time. You just have to know how much what we call wiggle room, how much. I'm sorry. I'm like Pavlov's dog. You just have to rattle the knob and I know what he's doing. So we purposely have stayed away from severance, but we've always encouraged you to keep in mind what the upside is, how much room you have between what you think it's worth and what you can afford to pay. So severance will never get thrown into any offer that you put forth. The second is operating plan. There is an operating plan assumptions in that study that was released in November. Where we're at right now, you may recall one of the key elements of the bench trial will be the district's ability to operate. And so if you want to know if you have a high likelihood of passing through a bench trial, it's time to tighten up the operating plan. You could certainly go forward without it and see what your chances are. One of the speakers spoke to the supply and demand analysis that has nothing to do with the Measure J feasibility study. There were no supply and demand numbers considered, mine or anyone else's. And the D-cell plant was the base case consideration, which is this affordable with the D-cell plant fully operational and running? So I think it's important to know that there's not any attempt to say, oh, well, we're just trying to get rid of a D-cell plant to make this cheaper. It's been looked at, fully spec'd out with the D-cell plant in it. That's all I had.
Okay, thank you. Director Byrne.
Well, I don't have a question. I kind of have a statement, I guess. I appreciate the comments regarding where's the funding coming from, because we've had this discussion. Funding this whole operation out of reserves is, I would say, not the optimum way to do this. the flip side is the community voted to burden themselves with this expense, and they will pay for it. It will be part of the overall expense. And that support for the voters kind of goes against my basic feeling of the fact that we don't have this whole operation funded in the front end.
Director Haldeman?
Yeah, for me, on the preliminary analysis, it's concerning to me that the draft that we received assumed a debt service rate of 4.5%, and then the final that's presented to the public was only at 4%. So that presumes that the district can borrow money at the same rate as the state of California. And that just seems to be to not be a reasonable assumption for the analysis. The other thing is that on page 56 of the report, under the desalination plant discussion, it stated that it is anticipated Cal-Am will receive approximately $180 million in SRF loans. It also says it is assumed that the district will assume the SRF loan from Cal-Am. Well, in the history of the SRF program, there is no precedent for a loan to be assumed by another agency from another agency. So that is just factually incorrect. And you can check the Water Board website. Cal-Am has not submitted any application for an SRF loan because there's they have a tracking website of submitted applications, and Cal-Am has not done that. The other thing is that Rule 19.8 states that it is the policy of the district to secure and maintain public ownership of all water production assets within the territory. Now, Sand City's desal plant is an integral part of the Cal-Am distribution system. It can't operate without pumping water into the Cal-Am system. Now, the report does not address the costs associated with acquiring the Sand City desal plant. Also, in my view, as much as I could glean from the analysis is that there seems to admit significant revenue requirements for capital asset replacement reserves. So from my perspective, I'd like to see us moving forward get a better clarification on the actual economic feasibility before we start going down the path of spending money on other stuff beyond economic feasibility, because I have serious questions about the analysis that was provided to us in the October 29th report.
Can we get those questions? Go ahead.
I don't exactly want to change the subject, but I want to add to the subject. It's a little bit spinning off of, Gary, what you said about other systems. I'm familiar with that language in Measure J where it says all systems to be publicly owned. I'd like to go on record, but also like to specifically ask if the district, Dave, if you couldn't provide some policy direction, for the interim at least, that this effort on feasibility is directly focused on Cal-Am and no other entity, no other asset. And I'm just suggesting that if there is to be a future acquisition considered, a little bit along with what you're questioning, I'd like there to be some rationale about under what circumstances, because that's not in a current priority, it's not in a working plan, it's not in a goal, it's nowhere except in And I would just like to say, this district would only consider another system only if certain criteria would be met. And I'd say if it's requested by the provider, we would consider it. If it's got quality or quantity deficiency somehow in the system, we would consider it. Or it's subject to substantial criticism or ratepayer demands or complaints. That would be maybe considered. But I'm just suggesting some potential criteria on where. But what I'd like to do is have those system owners kind of be reassured that this process does not include them. Or they're excluded for reasons. But anyway, I'm just wondering if that's possible. I just leave it at that.
I would
May I
concur.
ask a question? Isn't the Sand City desal plant publicly owned by the city of Sand City?
We were just going to go.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, just.
As is Seaside Municipal. Those are publicly owned systems.
And
Wanted
as
point
an
of
acquirer of
clarification.
CalAm, you would acquire their lease. There was a lease agreement with Sand City to operate. The borrowing rate, the current market was 3.5% at the time of the analysis, so it was deemed to be able to be reduced to 4% for purposes of the analysis. And that was a conversation between Barclays and Reptelis. And the state revolving fund talked to the folks at several different levels at the state, and there is specific language that says with the approval of the executive director you can assume. But we also ran scenarios where you don't assume and you replace it with corporate debt. And we shared those with the board in a package earlier.
You got to start all over.
Yeah. So I think where we're at is a really solid analysis that doesn't need a whole lot of change. Certainly, as I said, we included the Sand City lease as a cost. And the lease is available, and there's a table of lease rates every year. Changes to the borrowing rate were approved between the financial consultant and the bankers, and so on. So, and then, Mr. Riley, your comments, I think the August report to the board actually laid out almost all three of those desires, which is only look at other systems if you've got the corpus, if you have CalAm, because otherwise it would be operationally inefficient to pick one up over here and one over here. But if they're add-ons to the whole, then it made some sense. And I believe we also, in that, suggested that at the request of a system owner, we would consider it and try to do it at arm's length with willing seller, willing buyer, unless there's some water quality considerations in the state. DDW wanted a small system consolidation of some kind.
But wouldn't water systems like the Tehama, wouldn't that fall under
That would
what
fall in
George-
there. Yep.
George is trying to address?
Yep. Yeah, I think we identified pretty much all of the, what we call a water distribution system versus what the state calls a water distribution system, public water system, of which there are many. And some are very small, some are, sizable, like Kenyatta Woods, which is Montero Tehama. But none of those make sense as a starting point. If you can't do this, what the framers intended, then trying to add those others on is going to be really uneconomic for the district to even look at.
If CalAm changed rates, you go through these rate studies, 218 studies, and let's say CalAm changed rates.
Yep.
What happens? Do we start all over, or are we in that pickle, as they usually say it? And
well, that's why we've been challenged to talk about rates and cost of service separately. When you know what the revenue requirement is to run a system, that's how many total dollars do I need to operate this thing? And so the cost of service analysis basically says, is it cheaper in the total under one form of ownership than the other? But you could, as a new owner, come in with a new rate structure and make everybody confused because none of the tiers line up, or the first tier is higher, or what have you. And so that's when you start to have to look at rates. And so even under the current general rate case, I think CalAm is contemplating asking for moving from 5 tiers to 4. I think as a public entity, and you look around the state, even 3-tier block rate structures are normal. So if they were to move in a direction of a more traditional rate structure before the district were to acquire, if that was the direction you went, what happens after the acquisition looks completely different. So we don't know what the rate structure is going to look like at the time of an acquisition. So, I mean, the work to date, while the consultants did analyze rate impacts using the current 5-tier structure, that piece of the analysis will probably have no value in 4 years. But the total cost of service analysis will. But we want you to be able to look at what a rate structure might look like under a couple different sets of assumptions, because there's this concern that if you came in as owner and raised the first tier, everybody say, hey, wait a minute, you said it's cheaper and my rates went up. So what are the options? How can you be true to the spirit of this thing and still set up a rate structure that's legal under Prop 218 as well as implementable, that gets you all the revenue you need? And we're just not, we're not there yet.
I have another question. Is it possible that the consultants, and I've had several people ask me questions after the Embassy Suites presentation, and their question was, what happens in year 31? Because at some point, if, as mentioned tonight, you burn a mortgage or at the end of the mortgages, and then what happens the day after? The day after is your cost should go down. But I don't know, I don't remember seeing a reference to what happens at year 31. And I'm not even sure if it's should be in the dialogue. I don't know, but I'm raising the question that maybe it ought to be or considered, or at least can the consultants kind of react to how to present that kind of information?
Yeah, well, so we have asked that question, and we did not ask the consultants to do it. The two kind of feels right kind of stories are, well, three. One is that the rate of increase in your rates would be lower under public ownership. And we specifically did not ask the consultants to postulate on that. The second is that the cost of capital to do renewal and replacement and investing in the system is cheaper under public ownership. It's tax-exempt financing versus debt and equity in the corporate setting. And the third was the 31st year question, which is, gee, once we own it, everything's going to drop really low. Well, we did assume that the same rate of capital investment would continue under private ownership or public ownership. But the window we looked at was 20 years. So the 31st year, by design, was cut off. Its present value impact on the analysis is somewhat small. But how you feel about those three issues kind of sets the stage for maybe how you feel about the cost of service study for the 20 years we did look at, which is we did not take advantage of the feeling that it's cheaper and that it'll go up less quickly and that you own it in the 31st year. So those are things that I don't think we want to ask a financial consultant to layer in the feelings about those things.
30 years out.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for council. There we go.
There you go.
So on the CEQA portion of this item, the statement's made that to basically provide funding for things beyond the agendized purpose, which is consulting and legal work in advance of resolution of necessity. So I guess my question to council is that how appropriate is it for us to approve funding for things not associated with the agendized topic?
Well, I don't believe you're approving that funding at this point. You would be approving a competitive request for qualifications, and that would come back to you for action when that does return. That would certainly lay out what the scope of work would be for that to be done by those qualifications. But this board is not approving funding for the CEQA at this time.
And that estimate is just for this work.
But I mean, the idea of an RFQ, you send out a proposed scope of work, which, again, this seems to identify sending out a scope of work with the RFQ for work beyond what's on the agenda item. So that's why,
But your staff could send out an RFQ without the authorization of the board. The board would then act on when a set of qualifications come forth with a proposed work. You're not taking that action at this time.
So just, if I might, through the chair, so to that point, Dev, it does say that one of the recommended actions here is and authorize a total budget of 1.241 million. So that is a specific allocation. I would say that motion could be amended to say for amount not to exceed, but it does have a specific amount in that motion. So if, through the chair, just in the interest of moving this item forward, I'm prepared to make a motion, and if I get a second, I'd speak to it. I'd recommend that the board approve entering into new agreements with Rutan and Tucker, Reftelis, Close and Associates, sole source professional service agreements with Jacob Engineering and an MIA appraiser to be determined, and issue competitive requests for qualifications for CEQA work, and authorize a not-to-exceed budget of $1,241,000.
You got your second.
So, for me, this is part of an ongoing process that I think the public said they wanted to go through, and I would agree with Director Byrne when she said the expenditures were part of the approval of Measure J. There was no cap in Measure J as money to be expended on this. So I think the ratepayers knew that this was not going to be a cheap act. For me, that what we have now is just a very preliminary feasibility study. It's like a drive-by appraisal. The devil's in the details, and I don't have the details I need yet. I don't know the exact operation costs or the governance costs. I don't know the true real estate value. The CEQA and LAFCO process is undefined. The rate study's not known to me. And I think that when we get into this process a little further, we're going to go and have the questions asked and answered that will actually determine, is this going to be economically feasible or not? I always thought that I was 5'6", but I went and had my physical just recently. Apparently I'm not. I'm slightly shorter than that. So the changed circumstances are such that I'm disappointed, but I'm still going to go on. I just want to say that I think that there's a lot of interest in this. I think there's a lot of passion about this. But for me, this is time to separate the facts from the fiction and separate emotion from reality, and let's move forward.
Well, I agree with what Dave said, even though I balk at the expenditure, I don't think we have enough of the blanks filled in to actually make a decision that's required. So I would support the motion.
Jeannie, I would agree with you on that one. I'm very loath to spend more than $1 million, but I am a big fan of information and data, and I don't have enough from the preliminary report. I need more before this decision to move forward could come before me.
I said it earlier, and I'm saying it again. I think it's really part of our due diligence to move forward with this.
Go ahead, Gary.
no, I just wanted to say that I agree we don't have enough information yet to fully understand what the economic impacts are. But I'm just making it clear that I don't believe what's in the preliminary report cuts mustard for me anyway. And so I would hope that as we move forward with the appraisal and the other information, that I can reach a comfort level that the actual economic feasibility is clearly demonstrated.
And I hope that we get all the numbers that we need. That's one of the big things. I agree with Gary. We need to investigate, make sure that we get all the right numbers. Another factor I'm looking at is time. I'm looking at time. You're talking about another 8-9 months probably. I hope we be on time. If not, I hope we report to the public that it's not going to be on time. I want to make sure that we get it right. We need to get this right. And spending another $1,241,000, that's a lot of money. But I think I had a meeting with some people today, and they mentioned, well, it's $30 per customer or whatever that number is. So let's find out what that is for me, and so we can come back. So it's a little bit of money to see what it's going to cost us if we want to have our own ownership. So I hope that we get it all. I hope that we address some of the other issues that citizens brought out. Thank you.
One more comment, because these things have a way of extending and extending, I would like to see a deadline for this information by no later than the end of July. And I do want to remind everybody, the public voted to burden themselves with all the costs that it takes. So they are on the hook.
And just one more dovetailing on Jeannie's comment. Yeah, I would hope that parts of this could be done sooner as opposed to later. So I would think we should try at best to expedite the gathering of the information so that we can not prolong this any longer than we have to. What I mean by that, not prolong it, but reach a decision point sooner as opposed to later.
So through the chair again, if I might, Dave, is the July date doable? 'Cause
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, I'd be willing to include that in my motion, and if the seconder would agree.
I don't want to handcuff you because the other report you got in there with 30% behind. Remember the feasibility study. Now, I want to get it right. I want to get it right. If you feel like you can get it, and I don't want no fly-by-night companies doing this work. Because that's what I'm hearing from the board. Get it done fast. So I mean fly-by-night. I can do an EIR. No, I don't, hey, I'll go with you on this, Dave, but it's up to you now.
The consultants were named in the motion.
Okay, but,
So
other
are-
issues.
Are you including it or not?
Yeah, I'm including it.
SEQA is the only thing that needs to go out on the street, and based on our conversation, if we can carefully define the scope of the work, I mean, our choice would be break it out from a comprehensive CEQA consultant and not do everything.
Well, it's extension of it's new extensions of existing agreements, so the only one that's new is the MIA, the real estate, MAI.
Well, and the CEQA.
And the CEQA, yeah, but still.
So we
it's
should
not-
be able to do all that.
You'd be able to have a consultant on board by
And if
then.
we're confident that we can head down a path of mitigated negative debt,
Okay, and just,
then it should be a lot cheaper and quicker. Yeah.
oh, one more thing. Dave, are you planning on going to each city council and tell them what we are doing, where we've been, where we at, and where we going?
At your direction as a board, I'd be happy to do that.
Well, I like, a lot of people don't watch the show on TV. So,
No, really? Damn.
what? Excuse me, board meeting.
All-Stars.
Don't watch our board
Disappointed
meeting.
Shocked.
So I just want to make sure that you're getting out, I like you to come to Seaside and explain what is going on. So, okay. Not on this.
So
Through the
is
chair?
your,
It's just a response back. I feel like what we should have is a really very specific sort of plan of outreach.
Yes.
So that could certainly be part of it, but I think that's something that we need to develop and put a little more time into.
Thank you.
okay, is your second valid on the
Yeah,
amended motion?
it's valid
Okay.
on moving ahead.
So then,
Chair, just a clarification. Director Potter, you'd indicated a dollar amount, which is different than what's on the proposal, so I just wanted a clarification. as
Dollar
to
amount
the-
I said was $1,241,000 in the budget, not to exceed that amount.
Okay, so it was the full amount?
Yep.
Okay,
Not
thank
to
you.
exceed.
Thank you.
And a clarification on the motion, is it a target of the end of July? I forget what the number.
No, no later than the end of July.
See, I'm a little concerned about a hard stop like that unless there's some wiggle room. Who knows what might come up that just takes longer than that? And are we over a barrel?
You can always
with
bring
a
it back to the
deadline?
board. You can always bring it
If
back.
there's,
to the
if
board.
there's justification for an extension, I'd be happy to vote in that direction, so that's just
Yeah,
my
I think we should just give you monthly updates as we're
Lovely.
moving, and if something bad is,
call it right.
Okay.
okay, so there is a motion from Director Potter to follow the staff recommendation with the change of a not-to-exceed budget of $1.241 million
End of July.
and an end of July date for the completion of the work. And it was seconded by Director Edwards. And so I'll call the question. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries unanimously. And we'll move on to item number 13, consider modification to MPWMD meeting rule number 6, spokesperson.
This came at the request of Director Edwards to take a look at what authority a director has to speak on behalf of his constituents as well as to speak on behalf of the full board. I thought that I met the nature of what he was looking for, and immediately Arlene read it and said, this is too confusing, so we will take any help you can offer. But the idea was that when you go back to your divisions from which you're elected, I think the expectation should be you're speaking on behalf of the board or what the board is doing as a board to your constituents in your division. So that would be a change where you're now authorizing individual division directors to basically say, hey, this is what we're doing on your behalf here in my division. So that was one aspect. And then when speaking elsewhere, I know we like to say, I'm a director for the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District, but I'm speaking as an individual. And it's not just you, it's every public agency will leverage that because you put the imprimatur of who you are and then you say, but I'm actually talking as this person over here. So I think you have every right to do that. But what this adds is just that you can clarify you're speaking on behalf of your division or as an individual, not on behalf of, as a board as a whole. So that would go to the like the Coastal Commission, just a small clarification. And, you know, obviously you don't run unless you want to be in tune with your constituents and have opinions. So it's really your option to say what you want to say and how you want to say it, but it would be best always to clarify that you don't speak on behalf of the board in those situations. But if you want to say I speak on behalf of my constituents as an elected director for my division, that's a little bit different than saying as an individual. And I suppose then if your constituents don't like it, they'll change their representation at some point. So that was that. So those are the things in bold. And then the way the meeting rules have been written, they kind of inverted the correspondence came before speaking as an individual, so I just reversed those. But I'm willing to take edits, and I don't know if this gets you, Director Edwards, to where you want to go and not at the expense of where the other directors want to put things. So
I think as long as it's perfectly clear that the person is not representing the board as a whole, that's the key issue, and that goes for every city council, every board of supervisors, every political organization. I mean, it has to be really clear you're speaking as your person. In this case, you're speaking to your district, but you are not speaking as the board as a whole.
So did I hear some thought that there was, you felt there should be some language that included going back and canvassing your constituency as to how they actually felt on the issue before you went forward and represented them? I mean, I understand it, it seems a little difficult.
it's very difficult. So, you know, you guys have all been elected more than anyone else has been elected. I got elected 3 times to school board, and you want to believe that you're representing your constituents, and then you discover, no, I'm only representing, 56%, or, and half of those now hate me, so, yeah. So, you get to spin it any way you want. The important thing is saying I do not represent the boards or the board as a whole. I think that would have been helpful at the Coastal Commission, of course, but I don't think you should be completely, gagged, to speaking on behalf of water issues.
I think the problem, and I get where I'm going with this, I think it's fine, but what if you had 4 commissioners, 4 directors show up, and they say, I'm speaking on behalf of my district, and we're opposed to, babies using bathwater. I mean, then you've got a quorum of the board speaking, even
all
though
saying the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then it obviously is an informal meeting.
Well, isn't that a Brown Act violation?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Technically, that's not a Brown Act violation, because that, as you pose that would be at a announced public meeting under public notice, so you would be able to do that. But if you showed up at a public forum that was not noticed under the Brown Act, then you could not have 4 of you making that expression.
Are there any other questions?
Maybe you want
Well,
to cap it then.
Well, I don't know if we're in question or some it sounds like
We're
comments
in
as
question,
well.
and I'd like
Oh,
to
no, it's a
accept public
question.
comment also.
But just briefly, I'm comfortable with the first part, but the last part of speaking on behalf of their division, I think is what Director Potter is getting at is problematic. And that clearly we should have the flexibility of going out and saying what's happened here at the board. And so I'm comfortable with the first part, but just not the second part.
So you would say you were striking on behalf of their division?
That would be my suggestion.
Right.
So simply speaking as an individual?
Well, it would be the existing language for that sentence,
So
but
sort of
adding the however.
to further complicate it. So Dave, what if they didn't announce that they were a director, but were simply they're entering their own opinion? It's announcing your director that you're a director, and there's 4 of you, and it's a quorum, a majority of the board. That's my problem. And I understand what you want to do. I support what you want to do. I'm a big supporter of freedom of speech, but I don't want to go breaking the law by doing that.
Well, once again, you could have 4, you could have 7 of you, as long as it was an announced public meeting of another body. But if it was a community forum, if you're speaking to the Chamber of Commerce, that's not an advertised program, then no, you could not have a majority of the board expressing their opinions. The whole key is the whole public invited, and are you speaking on that topic?
I still don't see how you get around the fact that it's a publicly noticed meeting, but you still have a majority of the board speaking.
That's an express exception to the Brown Act that allows that.
Huh, okay.
So I'd like to open this up for public comment, if anyone wishes to speak on this item.
Good evening, Judy Lehman. This has always been, it's kind of the reverse when you're part of the public, trying to figure out how you can get information from your representative and back to the representative. And I know as community representatives, you have neighborhood associations that you can be invited to or extend your information to them. But the comment has always been kind of, how does the mayors all get together on their monthly mayors meeting and talk a little bit about water, and is that a good avenue to get feedback from the mayors group and also from the supervisors? So I think those are all things that when you have your report of the outside meetings that you go to, that would be something interesting to hear, how much outreach you are doing within your constituency. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lehman. Anyone else wishing to speak on this? Okay, then I will close public comment and bring it back to the board.
I'd make it, oh.
Go ahead. I would like to keep division in there. So I can say I'm Alvin Edwards, Director of Division 1, speaking for Division 1. So that way, when you go up there as an individual, well, like my mayor said the last meeting, well, you speaking at the wrong time. You supposed to be speaking at public comment. And I'm a director, and we got a part where we speak as organizations. So I like to keep the division in there. Or, the division, and if you want to go up there and say you're speaking as an individual, you can do that too. But I like how it's written right now. That's the way I like it. And I think Mr. Laredo cleared it up, that I don't care if we all got up there and say I'm from Division 1, Division 2, 3, 4, and 5. And, I have a different opinion. But the general manager will speak for, if we took a vote and we all may have disagree with it, I think it's in here where the general manager is that spokesperson that would clear that up. Yes, it was 4-3, and this is how they feel about it. So.
I'd like to make a motion that we accept the language except for on behalf of their division, and strike that and accept the rest.
I'll second that.
Okay, so there's a motion to accept as written and strike the on behalf of their division by Director Byrne, and a second from Director Hoffman.
May I, on the motion?
Yes, we may discuss.
what does that accomplish? I mean, what does that do? It seems to me it takes the heart out of the change. And it seems to me the interest in the change, my district, for example, I have 3 jurisdictions. And most of us have 2 jurisdictions, generally. I just think it makes it clear that if you were elected in a division, and that's where you campaigned, and that's where you spent your time, and that's what got you to where you are, whether you appreciate it or not later, I don't know. That's a different question.
You ask yourself that all the
But-
time.
We're leaving that in.
But what you're taking out, I think, is the heart, or am I misreading?
It's this part down here,
Oh,
because what you have to allow is that you're not speaking for the, as.
oh,
for the
I
board
see,
as
it's
a whole.
I see.
So it would read, board members shall clarify that they are speaking as an individual and not on behalf of the board as a whole when they make oral or written statements regarding water matters.
Oh, and I was taking it out of the first reference.
Yeah, I get it.
I see.
I appreciate that clarification.
Yes, I
Yeah.
apologize.
Okay.
But I think Director Edwards' request was that one specifically. You wanted to be able to be at some outside event and say, I'm the elected director from Division 1.
That's my point, right
That's
there.
exactly
That's
right.
what I did at the Coastal Commission, and people say, oh, you violated. No, I said I'm from Division 1, and I'm speaking for Division 1.
Board to make that.
You're right. You can still do that.
Okay.
However, a board member may speak on behalf of the district within the division from which the board member is elected when reporting on district activities. So you've got that.
I interpreted that sentence to mean if I go back to
Yes.
one of my neighborhood associations or my Monterey City Council meeting, I can speak within my division
Right.
about the board activity.
Right, that
But
was
not
intended.
if I would go to.
Then I agree with Arlene. It's not very well written.
But essentially, if you're speaking to the Coastal Commission, as an
Yeah,
example,
yeah.
you cannot say, I'm Alvin Edwards, and I'm on the Monterey Peninsula Water Management Board, and I'm speaking here on behalf of Division 1. You can't say that. You can simply say, I'm Alvin Edwards, and I'm on the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District, and I'm speaking as an individual.
Right,
Right.
exactly.
So that's what the new language would allow us to say, not that as I'm speaking on behalf of Division 1.
I want to say I'm speaking on behalf of Division 1.
That's what I thought.
I'm-
That clears,
that
Substitute
language.
motion for
I'm not
continuance.
speaking for the board, I'm speaking for
Continuance.
Division
Right,
1.
you wanted the language to
You
remain
want
as.
to
Yes,
another meeting?
yes.
Send it back and have them fix it.
Okay,
I'd offer a substitute motion to go ahead and continue this item to have it wordsmithed as direction. Obviously, there's been some confusion about it, and I think it would be better if we had to come back with text that we all could agree on, given the direction you've heard tonight.
I second that.
So just for clarification, the 2 pieces we're trying to get at is when a director goes into his or her division and speaks to a neighborhood association or a city council or whatever, the theory was that we'd like that director representing the board as a whole, supposedly, representing activities of the board as a whole. So that was a kind of internal one. Externally, we don't want an individual representing the board as a whole, and that's where this comes down to, do you get to say you represent Division 1, or just, I am a board member, but I'm speaking as an individual?
I like telling them where I'm from, what division I represent, Division 1. So that means I'm not speaking for the whole board. I'm speaking for Division 1.
To any group, speaking to any group.
Any group.
I mean,
Yeah,
if he's
and I think we
speaking
get
within
rid of
his-
the
If he's
language
speaking
on-
within his own division, they're gonna know who he is.
Yeah.
It's not like Alvin Edwards just dropped out of the sky in this division.
Well, hey, I don't want to be speaking nowhere, someplace else, and somebody out there looking. That's what happened at the Coastal Commission.
okay, so there is a substitute
Did I get a
motion.
second on that? I think I got
You
a
did.
second.
Yeah.
There was a substitute motion from
Alvin seconded.
Director Potter to continue this to future meeting after further wordsmithing, seconded by Director Edwards. I believe we vote on the substitute motion
Right.
first. So on that, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
Okay, so that motion carries 6-1.
The matter is continued.
So the matter is continued
Thank you.
to the next
All right,
meeting.
Painful.
Great. So then we will move on to item number 14, conduct election of board officers for 2020.
Yes, this is the annual rotation or election of board officers, as well as affirmation of the board's secretary and treasurer. The recommendation is to follow the rotation under Rules 2 and 2.5, where Director Byrne would become the vice chair and Director Edwards would move into the position of chair. I would remain as secretary and Mr. Prasad would remain as treasurer. But in order to do so, someone needs to make a motion to do so.
When we need some public,
I'll
possible
be
public
happy to
comment.
move that.
Oh, yes,
I'll move the slate.
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. However, I believe this item is open for public
Exactly.
comment, so I would like to open public comment. Anybody wishing to speak on this, please do so at this time. Seeing none, I'll close public comment, bring it back to the board. We have a motion from Director Adams for the slate as presented, and a second from Director Potter. Okay. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. And with that, that is the end of my term as chair. I would
Well
like-
done, Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very well done. And my sympathies on some of the issues you've had to deal with.
Thank you. So,
It was tremendous grace.
well, thank you, I appreciate it. So, we are adjourned, and I pass the gavel to Chair Edwards.
Thank you. Hit it hard. Yeah. Good meeting. Good meeting. Got through.